is titled The Common Good. Why are you writing this book, and why are you writing it now?
I'm writing the book, The Common Good, because there is a large question hanging over the United States and really over many countries now about, is there something that connects people to one another? Is there any meaning to a nation now when we have basically, and we should have, a lot of people crossing borders? That's not a bad thing. We have in the United States a multiracial society. That's a good thing. We also have in the United States and Canada many different languages, many very different ethnicities. What is it that connects people? What is it that is a nation? In the era of Donald Trump, that becomes an even more urgent question to answer. And I attempt to answer it. It seems to me that the common good is a matter of what we owe one another as members of the same society. And in the United States, that begins with some fundamental ideals, many of which Canada shares.
Let me ask you, because having gone through the book, you know, you're very clear, and people would expect this to be somewhat partisan, given that you served under under President Clinton. But you talk about in the book that Trump is not the cause, but it is the or President Trump is not the cause, but the consequence over what has unfolded over the years. Can you unpack that for us a bit, just so we can understand where you're coming from?
Yes. For many, many years, in fact, 35 to 40 years, depending on how you measure it, most workers in the United States have not seen an increase in pay adjusted for inflation. They also have become less and less secure. So many are worried. In fact, the latest data I have show that 68% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. They don't have any savings at all. And if there is any downturn in the economy, or if they lose their job, they're in very, very bad trouble. Now, in that atmosphere, even though unemployment is very low, in that atmosphere and in that sort of set of economic conditions, a demagogue promising whatever the demagogue promises and blaming others, whether the others are other countries or foreigners generally or immigrants or minorities inside the country, for the problems that are not due to these scapegoats, and they are scapegoats, and that's what you would expect. That's what history shows happens when so many people are anxious. And on top of that, you have a Democratic Party in the United States that really hasn't responded to the needs of a lot of these people. On top of that, you've got Donald Trump himself, who has all the characteristics of a demagogue, and who during the 2016 campaign basically took all of the air, all of the oxygen out of the air by ranting and raving and doing exactly what a demagogue does.
Let me, you know, it's interesting when you go through this. There's a couple things you said there. First off, I mean, you talk about the fact that those who are not financially fortunate right now don't have much of a cushion. But if you were to look at the high level, say the economy is booming, unemployment's never been so low, the markets are all-time highs. So some people might say that some of the stimulation that's been put in place has actually been pretty good, but it's uneven, and that's what I hear much of what you talk about in the book.
Yes. Well, there's a structural change that's occurred over the last 40 years, which is very different from the business cycle. Right now, in terms of the business cycle, we are in very good shape if you measure it in terms of either the stock market or low unemployment. But behind the business cycle has been this long-term structural problem in the United States. It's been a problem in other countries, not quite the extent of the United States, but the median wage, the wage right in the center, has not increased at all if you adjust for inflation over the last almost 40 years. And on top of that, as I said, you have less and less economic security. More and more people feel like the game is rigged against them. And this is something that is relatively new in the United States. Surveys done in the 1960s and 1970s asking Americans, do you trust the government to do the right thing all or most of the time? Do you trust the private sector, corporations, to do the right thing all or most of the time? In the early 60s, over 60% of Americans said yes. There was a very high level of trust. But that trust toward government and the private sector has steadily declined over the last 40 years as the economy has not rewarded. In fact, the economy has created more and more anxiety for more and more people. I think those are connected up, and they are connected to the rise of a demagogue in the form of Donald Trump.
Let me ask you, I think one of the more fascinating things when they go through this, and I admit obviously I'm a Canadian, I don't live in the United States, and everything, it's been kind of secondhand what I read, but I've always thought of the U.S. as, it was born in revolution. It was something that, people could pursue capitalistic ideals, and you really highlight, I think here, quite nicely talking about the American ideals, that it's more than that. I mean, it's pursuing things, but not at the cost of others, and that seems to be what you really focus on within this, is that it's become almost kill or be killed, as opposed to we can all prosper.
And that is the other side, in fact, fills out the story in the book. It's not just that average workers are less secure and their wages have gone nowhere over the past 40 years. It's also that most of the economic growth and most of the gains from growth have gone to the top. And instead of taking those gains and acting responsibly with them, what we see in the United States is more and more of the people at the very top who are the recipients of most of the economic growth, most of the economic gains. They're turning around and they are bribing legislators with their lobbying, with their campaign contributions. They are insisting that companies basically forget social responsibility, forget unions, fight unions, destroy unions, actually, in the United States. Union membership is now down to a tiny percentage of what it was 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. And with that money, what they've done essentially is said to corporations, your only responsibility is to maximize shares of stock. And Kim, in the United States, the top 10%, the richest 10%, own about 80% of all of the shares of stock. So when you maximize the shares of stock, what you're doing is you are simply making the rich or the richer, the well-off, even better off.
You talk about exploitation. I kept thinking back to my early economic courses of free riding, about, you're benefiting from all the things that have been built over the years, but not giving back or helping build it forward. What do you do? This is the thing. I mean, I think you go through this and you got a couple ideas, but when we're at this stage, or when your country or the world, you could say, is in this stage, what do you do at this point?
Well, this is why I wrote the book. I think what you do is you try to ignite a conversation about what we owe one another as members of the same society, what it means to be a citizen of the most powerful nation in the world, and you use, and I tried not to make this a book about Donald Trump, but to the extent that he's there and he can't be avoided, you use him as an object lesson in terms of getting the country and getting the people of the United States and anybody else who's interested, getting them out of complacency. Democracy, democratic institutions, the institutions that of the private sector, our market system, all of that depends on trust. It depends on people feeling that the system is actually working and working for them. When you lose that sense of trust, when people feel like the system is rigged, then you can be in a downward spiral, which is what we are in now. The only way of reviving it, the only way of creating a kind of positive cycle, virtuous cycle, is if people do what the United States did in 1901, between 1901 and 1916, for example, following the last Gilded Age of the 1880s and 1890s, and that is reform the basic institutions of government and the private sector. The progressive era, we called it, and that progressive era was responsible for saving capitalism and saving democracy in the United States.
And how does that happen? I mean, give me some specific examples that you think that could ignite that conversation you're talking about. Like, what would you like to see people do? What would you like to see happen? I know you talk about the fact that you could have civic education of everyone doing 2 years of work in terms of helping things, but like, what specifics would you like to see happen?
Well, on that specific point, 2 years of public service required of every young person would inculcate a sense of patriotism that is not based upon, saluting the flag and securing the borders and kind of superficial marches and anthems, but a sense of patriotism that really is fundamentally based on a sense of giving and sacrificing for the good of all, and understanding that we're all in this together. Another thing I talk about in the book is honor and shame. Instead of naming buildings and providing honorary degrees to people who are very rich, who simply are generous and give a college or a university or a museum a lot of money so that they can put their name on the marble, what we really ought to do is honor people who are and have distinguished themselves in terms of the common good, sacrificing for the common good, people who are often unsung heroes of the common good. And we should be shaming people who are doing just the opposite. There are a lot of people in very important places in American society, and I dare say in other societies as well, who have taken the attitude of whatever it takes to get more money or whatever it takes to get more power, even if it means sacrificing the institutions that hold society together along the way, those people ought to be shamed. They ought to be humiliated. Society cannot maintain the guardrails of the norms that provide guidance to future generations unless we hold people accountable. And too many corporate executives and too many government officials have simply got by in this country, and a lot of very wealthy people have got by without any accountability at all. I go through in the book about a lot of things that can and should be done, but nothing will be done, Kim, unless people understand that we are in a crisis of governance and the common good, that we are in danger of losing what is essentially the most important thing about a country, a nation, a society, and that is the sense that there is something that binds us together other than simply the superficial rudiments of patriotism, as I mentioned.
Robert Reich, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kim.